Welcome. My name is Lynn McManus, and I'll be the moderator for this Engineers Without Borders webinar, How to Complete the 521 Pre-Implementation Report. This presentation is one of the core programs in the expanding series of online, on-demand, continuing education programs created by Engineers Without Borders USA and presented by Contract Solutions Group. Before I turn the program over to our presenter, I'd like to make a couple of announcements regarding the program. As our program begins, you'll notice that the program itself will fill the majority of your computer screen. On the lower left of your screen, you'll see a Pause Play button. If for any reason you need to pause the presentation, click once on the Pause button. To restart the program, simply click on the play arrow that will appear in the same place. If you should need technical assistance, please click on the email link for client services at Contract Solutions Group, located on our website pages. Or you may call us for assistance from 7 a.m. Pacific Time until 4:30 p.m. Pacific Time, Monday through Fridays. If you're disconnected from the webinar due to local internet issues, simply log back in through the Engineers Without Borders website and restart the program. After the program, you'll be taken directly to the attendance reporting page. It is very important that you complete this short form and submit it immediately upon completion of the program to receive full credit for your participation in the program. If this step is bypassed, neither you nor your chapter will receive credit. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter for the program, Peter Waugh. Peter earned his BS and MS in civil engineering at the University of Colorado in Boulder and has a total of 25 years' experience working in water resources, structural engineering, and roadway engineering. He has been a project manager at the EWB USA National Office since January 2008. Peter served in the Republic of Seychelles as a Peace Corps volunteer and has worked on EWB USA projects in Mexico and Guatemala. He's a licensed professional engineer in the state of Colorado. Peter, I'll turn the program over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Lynn. And thank you to the chapter members who have decided to watch this webinar. Our webinar today is about how to complete the 521 pre-assessment report. But more than just completing the report, what we hope this webinar does is help you go through the thought process of putting together the document, and that will help you plan a better trip and hopefully get more out of the trip to your community. We like to start all our webinars here at EWB USA with our vision and mission statements. We do that mostly just so we're all reminded of what is the unifying thing that keeps the national office, all the chapters, all the volunteers moving in the same direction. And what we're going to cover today is, first of all, we're going to go over some background information for the EWB USA, our program quality and project process, because really that's why we're doing this 521 document, is to fit into this overall quality assurance that we have for our organization, which will hopefully get us better programs and projects in the long run. Secondly, we'll go over what are the purposes of an assessment trip, and then what are hopefully the outcomes from your assessment trip. And then we'll go over two examples of the type of data you might collect on an assessment trip. Firstly, we'll do one that would be your first assessment trip to a community. This is regardless of whether it's a water project you may have or a bridge project. On your first assessment trip, you're going to have a lot of commonalities in the data that you're going to collect. And the second example will be for, say, a second assessment trip to a site for a water supply project. We will then also go over just kind of basically the general expectations for completing the document and then we'll tell you how the document is going to be reviewed. What we're not going to go over today is kind of detailed step-by-step guidance. This is exactly how to march through putting together this report for a couple reasons. One is there's so many different ways of doing things. There's so many different communities and programs and projects, etc., that there is no one prescribed path through this process. And secondly, you as engineers, it's really your responsibility to come up with the best way of doing the trip and presenting this in a document. So firstly, let's go over our program quality and project process and just the background to start with. So EWB USA has over 12,000 volunteers working in over 250 chapters on 400 programs in 45 different countries. And the EWB USA National Office has 4 technical staff to oversee all this activity. So as you might imagine, in order to manage this much activity, this many projects and programs, EWB USA needs a rigorous quality assurance program. And an integral part of that program is the project process. And, this 521 pre-assessment report and assessment trip are integral parts of that process. And contrary to what a lot of student members may think, this project process, it's not just a bunch of hoops to jump through so that you can get to go on a trip. It has its basis in standard engineering methodology of identifying a problem, assessing that problem, coming up with an analysis and design of a solution, implementing that solution, and then after implementation, ongoing monitoring and evaluation. And so this is part of what you're doing when you're doing the pre-assessment report, and this is what you're going to be doing if you work as an engineer. This is what you're going to be doing your entire professional life. And so this is the project process, and we're just at the very start, the pre-assessment document. And I won't go through all of it, but really we're just talking about how do you prepare for the assessment trip and gather data that you're going to need for a successful design, implementation, and completion of the project. So what are the purposes of an assessment trip? It's always kind of good to start at that point when you're thinking about, well, what are we going to do on the assessment trip? And you think, well, why are we going there in the first place? Well, I mean, one of the most basic things you're doing is trying to assess the viability of the program. So it's economic viability, social, environmental, technical. All of this, you're trying to assess whether the program that you have, whether it's a water project or a bridge project, whether this is going to be viable for you to work on and for the community to assist you with. Secondly, you're going to be assessing the long-term sustainability or the potential for long-term sustainability of the program. You want to be able to make a go, no-go decision about continuing with the program and the community. And I think a lot of chapters think that once they've done the first assessment trip, they're kind of locked into working with this community for the long term. And, while that's always the ideal, that's what we'd like. We'd like you to form a great connection with this community and have a great program with, different projects that you do maybe over a 5 or even 10-year time period with this community, we have to be realistic also that when you go and do the first assessment trip, you have no information about it. You may get there and realize there's some fatal flaw and not be able to continue with the program. So anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that is something you should be thinking about on your first assessment trip. And then, of course, this next one is what kind of everybody thinks about first off as engineers as one of the purposes of an assessment trip, and that's gather enough data to enable the future analysis and design of whatever infrastructure is proposed for the site. And then you also want to, lastly, gather baseline data for monitoring the program in the future. So you want to have something to compare to after you've done your implementation. So let's say you're doing a water project, you want to gather baseline data of some kind. Perhaps the most appropriate for your program would be the amount of time spent by community members hauling water from a nearby river. And you're going to be installing a distribution system for that water, and the point of that is to save the time and effort in gathering water. So one of the things you'd want to know is baseline data. How much time do people spend before we've done anything gathering that water? And now let's look at some of the outcomes for an assessment trip. So after a first assessment trip, number one, your chapter should be able to make a reasoned, rational decision about the feasibility of this project. You may go to the site, and actually what happens in most cases, the community will be ready for you, you'll have an NGO there, and you'll just start collecting data and getting to know the community and finding out what the community needs are, and the program will just go from there. But in the rare instance you get to the site and there's some fatal flaw, you've got to have a clear-eyed view of that, and then make a decision as a chapter, which you will review later with the national office, about whether to continue with the program. So let's just take an example. You may get to the site, and what you had thought that the community would be very eager and anxious for you to come. Maybe you get to the site and the community is apathetic or even hostile towards you being there. They really don't want you being there. Clearly that's just not going to be a go, because one of our principles that we use as principles of development for EWB USA is that this is a partnership between the community and the chapter. And if the community is not a willing partner in this, it's not going to be a go. And as a chapter, you should make that decision kind of right there that it may not be a feasible project. Secondly, after you come back from your first assessment trip, your chapter should know what the first project should be. A lot of times, you go into the project, let's say you've adopted a project off the EWB USA website, and the program is in a certain community, and the first project is supposed to be a water project. You go there, you start talking to the community, and indeed they verified that their primary priority is water supply. So you've you've confirmed that with the community. Now you know what the first project in that program will be. Alternatively, what has happened, and I can think of the Denver Professionals chapter, when they adopted the project, they were led to believe it was a water supply project. They went to the community and they did a very thorough assessment of the community and did a lot of meetings with community members and really listened to the community. And it turned out that water supply was not the primary priority of the community. Really, what they wanted was a sanitation project. And so the Denver Professional chapters had to kind of turn on a dime and then realize, okay, the first project is no longer a water supply project like we thought. It's a sanitation project. And so when they came back from their first assessment trip, they knew that, and they were ready to go then on a sanitation project. And lastly, you should have enough information to be able to develop a general written agreement with your community. A lot of times these are called memorandums of understanding, but basically it's some kind of a written document that would be signed by the chapter, the community, and a lot of times also with your partner non-governmental organization, your partner NGO. So the three of you would sign this, and then that kind of lays the framework for your work in the community. You don't have to have it signed at the end of the first assessment trip, but you should have enough information to basically develop a draft version of it so that you can then send it back to the community for their review. And then maybe, when you get there for your second assessment trip, you can have a little signing ceremony and everybody can sign the document. So let's think about the outcomes of a second assessment trip. And so on the first assessment trip, you decided this program is a go. You realized it's a water supply project, and you gathered the data good enough for putting together a draft memorandum of understanding that now you're bringing back to the community for this second assessment trip. And so now, after the second assessment trip, your chapter should have sufficient information for the complete design of the proposed infrastructure. And you should have enough information to develop the project-specific agreement with the community, including information about their long-term operation and maintenance of the facilities. So now you're developing, you may have kind of a framework memorandum of understanding. Now you're getting really much more into the nuts and bolts, and this helps clarify with the community, and you're gathering enough information for this. You probably want to present it to the community on this trip, but enough information so that you can tell the community, if we install this water supply project, you are going to have a financial burden of X amount, and this is how we would suggest that you potentially take care of that financial burden. So you should have really sufficient information for a project-specific agreement. And now let's look at the first assessment trip data collection. So, you know what the outcomes are supposed to be. So now, what kind of data are you going to collect in order to be able to get to these outcomes? Well, first of all, on the first assessment trip, you have to know what the community wants. So in some manner, you have to find out what the community desires are. Usually that's done through public meetings of some kind, or you may meet with the local government, but somehow you have to tie that down. Secondly, you want to find out what the governmental structure is in the community and also the decision-making methods in the community. Because in a lot of cases, there may be a governmental structure of some kind, but then the decision-making structure is not exactly the same as the governmental structure. And so you'll have to work in both of those arenas in order to get full agreement from the community on what you plan to do. You, of course, want to get community buy-in for the proposed program. We always assume that the community has buy-in for this, for what we plan to do, just by virtue of the fact that they filled out the project application to get their, program accepted by EWB USA. But you have to really make sure that there is buy-in for this. And then community readiness for the proposed program. And that can mean a lot of things. It may mean that the community would like, this big complex water system, but they just don't have the financial resources or the manpower resources to maintain that on the long term. So they may want something, this big water system, but they're just not ready for it because they just don't have the infrastructure built up, the financial resources to take care of that. So in that case, the community may not be ready for your help. There's other situations where maybe there's two factions in a community, and say, one faction, wants this water supply project, another faction does not want the water supply project. You as an outside group, if you're stepping into that, there's no way that you have the cultural competency to negotiate that kind of a minefield. So while, maybe the community really could use your help, they're just not ready for it because they haven't agreed amongst themselves, what they're asking for. And then you want to find out what the community resources are and what their constraints are. So basically, what can they contribute to the success of this program, in what is limiting them, what are their constraints. And you have to take that into account when you're kind of dividing up the duties. Your chapter is going to do a certain amount of work, and the community is going to do a certain amount of work, and the tasks that the community will do always changes depending on what the resources of the community is. And then going on a little farther, the first assessment trip, the data collection, you also want to know all the stakeholders for potential programs, yet you don't want to get caught kind of far along in the design of some kind of project and then realize that you neglected to get one of the stakeholders on board. So, for example, if you have a water supply pipeline, the landowners along that pipeline route are, of course, all stakeholders. You have to get them on board so you get permission to cross their land. You'll want to know, and so almost all EWB USA programs have a local partner other than the community. It's a local non-governmental organization or, some other organization that helps out the EWB USA chapter. And you want to know what their resources and limitations are. I mean, in general, at the most basic level, the NGO is there to provide the cultural background to this area that you, coming in as guests, just can't have. So, one of the potential flaws in the EWB USA model is that chapters are just in the community for a short period, say once a year or twice a year. The way we make up for that is to have a local resource like an NGO that provides the continuity on site that the chapter may not be able to provide. And so you want to just have some really clear and frank discussions with your NGO. What do they expect out of this relationship? What can they provide towards the success of this program? Another really important thing to tie down on your first assessment trip is how are you going to communicate with the community from the U.S. So after you've returned to the U.S., how are you going to get through to the community? Because in my experience, when chapters have difficulty communicating with the community, a lot of times the program kind of falls apart. And so this communication may go through the NGO, or you may have direct communication with the community. Maybe they have email access. Heck, they may even have cell phones. And so, but just tie that down how you're going to do that remotely. You want to determine what all the existing community infrastructure is, water, transportation, everything, just on a most, basic level, so number one, how it affects your specific proposed project, but also just in general to get more information about the community. And then you want to get information for your future agreement with the community. And so all those things, and there's probably others that will be appropriate for data collection when you go for your specific program. Again, we can't really just give a list, get all this information and then you'll have everything you need for a first assessment trip. You really have to use your heads when you're at the site and be thinking at all times, what additional data should we be collecting so that we can help further this program. And so now let's look at, let's say this is a second assessment trip and it's for a water supply project. So this will be an example of data that you may want to collect for that assessment trip. Number one, define the characteristics of the existing water supply. And this you should really have pretty much in detail. The location, the supply rate, the water quality, if it costs anything to use, all this you should know pretty much exactly. Secondly, you should define alternative water sources. So what we don't want chapters to do is go to the site, pick out, they see one potential alternative water supply, like, oh, there's this existing spring, let's just use that. You should look at every single other alternative supply source in the immediate area so that you as a chapter once you get back to your university, you as a chapter can make a rational, reasoned decision about what would be the best alternative source for this community. You've got to think through the water demand. Without knowing what the demand is on a system, there's really no way at all of designing it. So until you've defined the water demand, you really can't go any further. And if you are in question about, how would we figure out what the water demand is, there's a number of ways of doing it. You can use just published sources from like the World Health Organization or something like that. You can take measurements at the community. There's a whole number of ways of doing it. Those are kind of reviewed in more detail in our water supply webinar, and also you can always discuss this with your project manager when we review your water supply assessment trip with you. If there's going to be pipelines, go over the potential routes. What is the route? How far is it? What is the soil type? What are the obstructions? Do you have to cross rock? Do you have to cross ravines? Is it really steep? Are there land ownership issues? Get all that tied down for any potential pipeline route. And next, you should always look at what are typical methods of water supply in the area. So if you're going to Honduras and developing a water supply for a small community, and the 6 other communities around here all have the same kind of water supply, it's they tap a spring, bring it to a water tank, and then a distribution system, there's probably a fairly good reason everybody used the same method. I mean, it's not to say you should jump to that methodology and just assume that'll be right, but you should look what everybody else has done in the area, and if everybody is going along the same path, there's probably a pretty good reason for it, and you should take that into account when you design your system. You have to analyze and assess the capacity of the community to operate and maintain the system. So if, for example, you put together a project that includes a well and a pump with a solar panel, then you have to make sure that the community, firstly, has the financial resources to maintain this and eventually to replace the pump, but also they have the technical resources in order to maintain the photovoltaic system, the pump, and the control system that maybe goes between the pump and the water tank. If they don't have the capacity to maintain and operate that, it's not going to be a sustainable system. One of the first things that you always look for when you're doing a water supply project, is this going to be a central supply for the community, or is it going to be a household level supply? And the difference between those two and how to go over those two, do an assessment for each of those and eventual design of a system, each of those two types, is discussed in more detail in the water supply webinar. And then you're going to want to look at the location for potential facilities. So if there's a source where you can put the spring box, say if that's it, or if it's a surface water diversion, where you would put your diversion dam or your side intake, where that might be located. If there's going to be a storage tank, where are locations where that may be appropriate to be placed. So you want to look for that and then make sure that the location of those facilities, you want to have all the information you can about those facilities. So let's say a potential tank location, you should have that photographed from absolutely every angle you can think of. You'll want a survey, a topographic survey of the site, and you'll want detailed soils information for that site so that if you end up putting a tank there, you'll have all that information for your analysis and design. And then you'll want to look at whether water treatment is required or desired in this location. And then looking forward to eventual construction, you're going to want to know what the availability, quality, and cost of materials for construction are. And, a great way of doing this is, you go to the neighboring town and just go to some of their hardware stores and just, start asking about materials, what they might and might not have. And if there's questions about, you're not sure what kind of stuff you're going to need, sometimes you can just go into a hardware store and just take a lot of photos of the walls of what they're selling, so that once you get back, you can kind of look at those photos if you can't remember if they have a specific thing or not. You'll want to figure out how you're going to transport materials to the site. So, if, for example, there's let's say a very steep slope to the site, and it's difficult to get a vehicle up there, and you're going to have to transport materials by hand. That may be a fairly significant issue when it comes to selection of the type of water tank you're going to use, for example. You're going to want to look into the availability of labor for construction, both skilled labor, commonly maybe a mason or even a construction foreman, and then unskilled labor, folks who just do just basic labor tasks. So, what are the purposes of the 521 pre-assessment report? Well, first of all, we hope it's a planning tool for the chapters. So if you go through the thought process of putting together a good 521 pre-assessment report, it's going to help you plan your trip. Secondly, it allows for review by the EWB USA National Office staff of your proposed trip. And, having reviewed a lot of these trips and having been on some, we can then let you know if we think there is anything perhaps missing from your plan, or if we have some information that you don't have that would help out on your trip, something like that. It allows us to review your trip and hopefully make recommendations that might make it better. And then lastly, it's documentation for future team members, so that you know what was planned on each assessment trip. Basically, if you remember towards the start of this webinar, we laid out all the steps in the quality assurance, quality control between the 521 pre-assessment report, which you're at right now, and the 527 program closeout. Well, if you're a sophomore or a junior or a senior, let's face it, by the time anybody gets to monitoring evaluation or program closeout, you will have graduated. And everything that you learned on the trip is going to be lost unless you document it. This is what we plan to do on the trip, and then after you get back, actually the post-assessment document, you fill that out, and that demonstrates what you did learn on the trip. Okay, well, let's go through just the two parts of the pre-assessment report. Number one is the administrative information, and that is really just slam dunk. That's a couple hours of your time just, completing basic information so that we know the who, what, why, where of the trip. Who's going, where are you going, what are the dates, that kind of stuff. And tips for completing it is just use the exact format that is given in the template on the website and complete every section. And so red flags for us as the project managers that indicate, gosh, there's something a little odd about this trip, potentially. We're not saying absolutely, but it raises a red flag for us. If you have a really big travel team, and that is, larger than 8, it's likely it's too big. The size of the travel team should be based upon the specific tasks that you need to do in the community and how many people the community can comfortably host. So in general, if it's more than 8, you're taking too many. If you don't list who's on the travel team, that's an issue. If you don't know yet who's on there, but you know how many people will be on the trip, then instead of putting their names, just put student 1, student 2, etc., just so you fill out that travel team completely. If there's no mentor listed, or there's no mentor resume, or the mentor that you do list is inappropriate, that's also a significant red flag to us. We have on our website the requirements for mentorship of programs and projects, and your mentor should meet these qualifications. A number of times I've had chapters say, oh gosh, do we really need a mentor? It's just an assessment trip, etc. And, long ago, we used to occasionally approve assessment trips without a mentor or with a mentor that might not have been appropriate. In each and every case, it was a mistake, and not only did we at the national office regret it, the chapter regretted it too, because a lot of times it was just a wasted trip. You need 2 health and safety officers for every single trip, and if you don't have those, that's a potential problem. If there are no travel dates listed, that's also a problem. If you don't know the exact dates, give us the best information you can, something to the effect 10 days travel during the last 3 weeks of January or something like that. That's the best you could do at the time. If there are very short or very long trips, that's also an issue. It's hard to come up with what is an appropriate length of trip for an assessment trip. But I would say taking out travel time and the days that you have so bad jet lag you can't really function, taking those out the number of days at the site should be somewhere, probably between 4 and 10, depending on the type of project and the complexity of the project. On occasion, it's appropriate to have longer assessment trips. If that's the case, just explain why you need longer ones. Sometimes just a very short one is needed, and just explain to us why you only need a very short one. If your submittal is late based upon your travel dates, and all the submittal deadlines are on our website, if you're late, that's an issue. And if you're doing your third assessment with no implementation, it doesn't mean there's a problem, but it just means that the project manager will want to discuss with you just to make sure that you have a clear path to the successful completion of this program. And so that was part one that we just talked about, the administrative information. Now part two is the technical information. And let's just go over the content for this. The part two really is no longer just a real, boilerplate, just answer the exact questions as they're asked, because this is your opportunity to show, what you plan to do on your trip. And so while we have an outline and template on the website, and you're absolutely welcome to use that, if there's some other format that better presents what you plan to do on your assessment trip, then please go ahead and use that. We're all for it. And things you'll want to do, firstly, complete all the sections, have an introduction that explains the purpose of this document, go over the background. If it's a second assessment trip, you may have some background. If it's your first assessment trip, there may not just be much in the background yet, but you can say what you know and say what you've done at your university to prepare for this. Line out what the objectives of the site assessment are. And it should really be a fairly detailed list of objectives. This is what we want to get done on our trip, and line that out so that once you get back, whether you've accomplished those objectives or not. If you go to the site not knowing what you want to accomplish, a lot of times, you don't accomplish near as much. And provide information about the community. And then the data collection, you should have a detailed plan for data collection, not just some general statement, we're going to collect data about water quality. So if you need water quality data, develop a water quality sampling plan. This is where we're going to sample. This is how we're going to sample. These are the analytes we're going to analyze for, and this is the reason we're doing all that sampling. And then come up with a schedule of tasks, and it should be a detailed list of tasks that demonstrates that the chapter has detailed knowledge of the work that you're going to be carrying out. And you should include the number of team members required for each task. So if, for example, you are going to be doing some topographic surveying, we're going to want to know if you have it listed, say, for 2 days, well, we're going to want to discuss that with you. Is that an appropriate amount of time? Are you using appropriate equipment, etc.? And then you want to tell us what you're going to be using as a decision-making criteria for the feasibility of this program. And then for the review of this document, so you've put together your document and you've submitted it, and remember to submit it according to the schedule on the website, and make sure not to be late. You know, we have specific dates there. If you're late by 2 days, you know, since we run on a batch process and do things once a month, if you're late by 2 days, as far as we're concerned, you're late by a whole month. And so that may necessitate you putting off travel, so make sure you get it to us on time. So the first thing your project manager is going to do is two things. Make sure it includes a health and safety plan, and number two, includes an appropriate mentor. If it does, your project manager is going to review the document. If not, the chapter is going to have to complete it and resubmit for the following month. So if there's no HASP or you don't have a mentor, an appropriate mentor listed, we're not even going to review the document. You're just going to have to do the corrections and get it to us the following month. And then after the project manager has done a full review of this, you're going to have a phone call with your project manager, and basically the project manager is just trying to decide whether you're ready to carry out the assessment trip. And what we do is try to determine if your chapter has met the first two of the fundamental canons of the Code of Ethics of the American Society of Civil Engineers. Number one, engineers shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public, and shall strive to comply with the principles of sustainable development. So, are you doing this for your trip? You know, have you done the requisite engineering to make sure you're taking care of that? And then secondly, engineers shall perform services only in their areas of competence. And this goes back to the mentorship. And so really that's all I have for today. If you have questions, then please contact your project manager, and we'll be happy to review that with you prior to putting together the document. But right now I will send it back to Lynn.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thanks to our participants for your attention. I want to take this opportunity to once again remind our participants that you must complete and submit your attendance on the following webpage to receive credit for attending this program. This concludes today's program, How to Complete the 521 Pre-Implementation Report, brought to you by Engineers Without Borders USA and Contract Solutions Group. Please check our online catalog often for the latest instructional programming from EWB USA and Contract Solutions Group. This program is copyright 2010 by EWB USA, all rights reserved. Thank you for joining